Hello everybody, how are you? Adam Steele here, and today is a bit of a surprise stream because I've just been kind of convinced to do it. It's Friday night, I'm sat at my desk, as I always am, and it's time to show you something I've been working on. I've been working on a track that finally got released just an hour and a half ago. By Malyan from Monuments called Sounds Like Fun. You might have heard me play around with this mix a little bit in a couple of streams or other places before it was released, but now the video is out. I filmed the video, edited the video, mixed the track, mastered the track, basically most of the stuff as it kind of turned out. I was quite prepared for somebody else to end up doing the mixing, but I got to play with it and Mike liked what he heard. He sent me a whole load of revisions and I changed the mix about 10 times. So I hope you're all doing well. If anybody's got any questions, I see Danny in chat. Hello everybody, come in, welcome. I'm going to first play the track because it's bonkers, and then I'm going to talk you through how we got to where we got to with it, because yeah, it's very drum centric because it's for a drum performance video, so keep that in mind. If the drums seem a bit loud, a bit forward, it's because the video was specifically for the drum playthrough. In hindsight, I would have backed the drums off a little bit now that I know that was the official release, but what can you do? It still hopefully sounds balanced to you. So let's play it back and then I'll talk about some of the stuff. All right, so that's the song that eventually became Sounds Like Fun by Mike Malyan. And yeah, the biggest focus was the drums. Almost everything you can see on that screen right now, down to that little kind of turquoise bit down there, that's all drums. I think we ended up with 26 channels of drums. We were going overboard, but kind of we had Middle Farm Studios, which is one of the best drum rooms in the country and arguably one of the best in the world, and a massive mic locker and a hardware locker and a big mixing desk and as many inputs as we wanted, and we just kind of went nuts. And it turns out we kind of, for this track at least, needed a lot of that. So yeah, and everything that's in kind of turquoise at the end there is in a group called Others. So actually the way that I've organized this, I can fold it down into drums, others, and 2 different reverbs. And that's kind of how I think generally about a lot of tracks. I don't generally have others. I don't tend to have like bass group, guitar group, vocal group. But I try and kind of take it down in terms of how I think about it to small numbers. And yeah, because we were focusing on it as a drum performance, it became drums and others because the goal for me was to make the others sound great, but then gel with the drums specifically, rather than like if there was a singer, they would take some priority, or if it was guitar driven metal, that would have to take some priority in a balancing act. Didn't have to do that on this, so that's why I grouped them that way, which is a little bit mad, but there you go. So the drums sound huge. And slightly different from what you might think. There's a lot of reverb going on that snare. There's quite a lot of low end going on that kick, but it's all about balance. Mixing is a bizarre process, even for me, and I do this for a living. Like, so, yeah, we had 26 channels of drums, and we had all these separate instruments that Mike recorded, which sounded like this. Now, yeah, I was quite grateful that there weren't any guitars to deal with in this, because it made it a very different mix experience, because I could really focus on letting the drums breathe. Now, I did mix this 3 or 4 different times, mostly just messing around with different approaches, different plugins, kind of using it as a punching bag a little bit, where I could try a different set of plugins out and go, is this better, is this worse? Is this more appropriate, less appropriate? And I really settled on some things that have become mainstays of parts of my mixing template now. The main one of which is the God Particle by Cradle. And this thing's incredible. If I turn this off, I mean, it's got a 5 dB boost on the input, and that's to get it to a level. And then the limiter's turned off and the EQ in it's turned off, so it's just the God Particle thing. But without it, everything just kind of sounds flat and dull without it. And then it brings everything, kind of pops everything out without that big pumping effect that you get from a lot of compressors, which I really don't like. And then at the end on my master bus, I've got Flatline by Submission Audio, which is my favourite limiter. Yes, I know it's a clipper right now, but all that's doing is just a couple of dB of a boost and just catching any peaks. You can see I'm not going for crazy levels on this. There's no need. We live in the Spotify age now. Even the loud bits, like, we're looking at -13, -14, and I'm perfectly happy with that. So now I can leave my master bus alone, because that's kind of how I work now, is I get the master bus. Even if I was sending this out to a mix engineer, I would turn Flatline off afterwards, make sure the level's not actually redlining, and then send that. But if I've got that to work into, if I do accidentally go over it, we'll just catch it, so I can render that out and send it to someone. But we were kind of done here. So the way that oh, hello Bill, yes, have fun at karaoke. Yeah, so where to begin? Because if anything, we had far too much in the way of drums. And so I'll talk you through what we had. So for the kick drum, let's just mute that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But for the kick drum, we had the Shure Beta 91. Very slappy, very punchy. AKG D12. Kind of cardboardy. And we also had a sub kick. And without the plugin on, it was kind of boff, 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 boff. But I used Waves Talk to turn that down a bit and really give me a bit of a chest moving thing. It's very different to just pitch shifting. It's a really cool little plugin, Talk. And that together with the other mics. Well, let's just turn the group processing off to prove a point. Come on, behave yourself. Doesn't sound bad, but we also in parallel ran all three of those to a hardware 1176 compressor, which isn't blended in very loud, but added in, it really gives things a snap and a slap. So I then added in a re-EQ here, because there was kind of a 200 Hertz wong thing that I wasn't liking. And then I used Viridian, it looks like, by Acoustica Aqua. So I'm boosting... Oh no, I'm dipping mostly. Yeah, I'm entirely dipping. Just a bit here, a bit there, a bit here. Because these are the A69TR. So these are the troughs. So I'm dipping out at 4.5K. I'm dipping out at 300 Hertz. I'm dipping out a little high end. Turn that on. But that's also giving it a big vintage saturation thing. And then the whole drum group is going through Viridian as well, which is the whole Viridian thing's giving it a big amount of guts. But can I give you the track without the drums so you can play live drums on it? No, I can't. Mike Malyan can, if you ask him. I did send Mike Malyan a drumless version, so yes, you'll have to get that from him. But yeah, underneath the kick drum, I did that thing that, you should not do, and I used the trigger. And that was the main trigger that I used, was the Backroad kick from Billy Decker. Not because the kick drum sounded bad, it really didn't. But there's something that I find a lot, and that just had an EQ to take away the high end from that, because I didn't want to add like a click, click, click. I'm not trying to add metal triggers. What I'm doing here is adding a thing. If I look at the curves, no, where is it? Actually, no, I've left the entire sensitivity on, but what this does is underneath the kick, it's got this. That. It's just got a solid, consistent ba 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 ba, which sat underneath quite quietly. Yeah, -12 underneath the kick. Just gives it something that without the kick sounds natural, but just a bit loose with it. We still hear all the dynamics of the kick because there's no bearing on the dynamics, but it just, when it hits, it really hits. Now the snare, we went a bit crazy. We used Neumann mics on the top and the bottom, and we had an 1176 paralleled on the snare, which in the end I didn't use. So I'm just going to turn these off and show you bit by bit what I did with the snare, because that was Luis. Hello, you're a little late, but you're not crazy late. So I've talked about the kick drum and the overall and played the track through. But yeah, this was the snare with no processing apart from the bus with the Viridian, which is just a little bit of EQ. And you can hear that out of context, the snare mic is super ringy and really has loads of bleed. So the first thing that I did is I used a re-EQ, which actually I took things out, but it just dips out a little bit of that honk, and that might actually be it. But Boz Labs Transgressor is the real MVP of this, because it just splits the signal into the hit and the sustain, and you can see with the sustain I've really taken that boing boing away. And with the transient, I've really boosted the low end on the crack. So it's not just a king, king, king. So it goes from this, with that St. Anger style ring, to that. And because that's controlled the transients by taking the high end away, I also don't need a gate, which means that all the dynamics get kept. And underneath that, I've got another trigger, which I know is a dirty word. Hello, Luis. Hello, Presian. Hello. All this trigger is doing is the room. There's no actual snare trigger on this. This is a trick I learned from Andy Wallace. You just have that gentle thing. And what have I done with the EQ on that? So the EQ's taking all the low end away from that, and there must have been a weight around 200 hertz that I removed. So underneath the snare, that's just adding a bit of a boomf. So let's just... Yep. And later, I added a track called Snare Rattle, which is something that I didn't add until near the end of the mix stage, so it might not make sense right now. But one comment that I got from Mike was that he wanted to hear more detail on the undersnare, but just turning up the undersnare meant that there was far too much of it. So what I did is I sent the snare bottom out to a separate aux. This is kind of like parallel compression. And I slammed it. So I've got that which is just slammed. But if I take that away, it sounds way less natural. And we do hear a little bit of cymbal bleed on that snare as well when it kind of opens the transient, but that's okay. We'll move on to the toms in a minute, but I've got this whole folder called tops because I had a crazy number of microphones for the cymbals and the rooms. I had a separate SM7 on the hi-hats, not an SM7B, an old SM7, which just sounds like that. So I've disabled this, so all I've got is a little bit of saturation and then a 700 hertz cut on that, and it won't be that different on the ride. Yeah, so the ride's got a little bit of airlift and a 360 hertz cut and saturation. The saturation really helps it sit. Without the saturation, it's too loud. I turned it down by a good 5 dB. But the saturation, instead of a compressor which would pump all over the place, just means it comes through more, but then you turn it down and it kind of levels it out a bit. It's hard to describe. And the ride especially, I really automated that to come up in the sections where we really wanted to hear ride cymbals. Then we went crazy. We had 2 sets of overheads. So I had a pair of Neumann KM184s. I also had a pair of Coles 4038s, and all I'm doing with these plugins is I think that a couple of the microphones weren't quite gain balanced, so that's just bringing the level up. So the Coles, all I've done there is there was kind of a honky wash at 1.4K. Remove that. I had an AEA ribbon, an R88 stereo ribbon in the middle of the room. Which was quite mid-focus, so I turned that down. And at the back, I had a pair of AKG 414s, which I dipped some mids out of. And as you can hear, I've got them really quite loud. They're really the basis of the character of this drum kit. If I enable all of those cymbal mics into this group, you can really hear it come to life, and that's through a heavy compression. What have I done with the... So I've boosted some low end, which is a little unusual, but that's to make the compressor pump specifically on the low end, and taking out some 300-ish hertz kind of mud. So without, kind of, yeah, makes it move. Then I've used the acoustica version of a Pultec to the mid version of the EQ. So it's mostly dipping around 3K and just brightening around 5, just to take a that was hurting my head away. Beyond that, this is where it gets a bit crazy. Eventide split EQ is something that I love for being super powerful. And so I lifted the high end beyond 15K with this. Did an overall dip around 3.5K again because it was still annoying me. And here the difference is you can split the transients and the rest of the sound. So I must have boosted around 300 hertz only on the hits and made sure it was really scooped the rest of the time. Let's listen without that. It'll sound a lot less defined. And yeah, without, it sounds much leaner, but without being anemic. And I chose the source mode here as cymbal mode. So it's listening out for different hits and separating the transients from the rest in a much better way. And then after that, I've got good old Soothe, which is being quite powerful. It doesn't sound that different with and without Soothe out of context, but in context, when everything else was going, it was hard to pick out some of the other instruments, and having Soothe there suddenly made the other instruments kind of come through. So that's why that's there. Now I have other tracks that were on the drums. It doesn't stop there, everybody, because I've got a pair of tracks panned left and right called Slam. And they were a pair of Shure mixers with the level lock, and they sound blasted. So most of this here is me bringing some more low end out and bringing some kind of beef in with 800 hertz and then dipping in between there at that 500, that kind of muddy frequency. Because that on its own sounds horrific, but if I turn it off, the rest of the drum kit will sound a little bit weak. Turn it back on. But it's the combination of that plus this, which is a Manly LOP compressor that Pete Miles ran everything into just for fun. So you can hear I've done a dip and taken the low end out with split EQ. And then that's got Soothe on it because really needed it because the L-op is quite transparent and quite bright. So that was really kind of pumping a lot, which underneath the rest meant I didn't have to do any kind of parallel compression stuff in the box. It was already done for me here. And then I've got another track, which was a DBX compressor. That was overly bright, but the DBX compressor was a bit of a weird one. It wasn't like a 160 or anything. It was the kind of compressor that you would use in a noise reduction system. So it just sounded odd. And that blended in had a thing. And then at the end, we had a real live EMT 140 plate reverb, and oh, it was so good. So I took the low end away from it because it was going boof, and there was kind of a honk around 4K. But that real plate reverb there really added something. And last but not least, hello Mike. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So the snare really came to life when I added the room and the snare, which I've not talked about. So the room reverb, this is a mix trick of mine, was to use a small room as kind of the mix source. And almost everything goes to this. You'll hear this. But not everything goes to it, and different things go to it in different amounts, which is why at this point in the track it sounds like it's really piano heavy. A short room with lots of early reflections and not a lot of reverb time. I find that, yeah, it really stops a track from sounding super dry. It brings everything together, and if you can find the right room and just make sure the EQ on it feels nice, then you can add tiny bits of tracks to this to really make it gel. Or if it's a really super dry sound that comes to life, this is how we do it. And the other reverb, which I called snare verb, was the big old machine, the Lexicon 480. And I'm pretty sure, yeah, that was the snare plate, which you just don't need to do anything to. I low passed it because it was getting a bit shiny on the top for this track, but that was about it, I think. I think I put a little bit of pre-delay on the early reflections just to let the snare breathe a bit more, but that was it. So yeah, I mean, thank you, Mike. That's a mix trick I do on pretty much every mix. It might be a different room type, depending on kind of the speed of the song or that kind of thing, but it's something I've always done, is that a band should feel like they played together in a room, and even if they did play together, if it doesn't sound like they were in that room, it should feel like it, and that's how I get there. So yeah, bringing those together with the drums. There we go. That's better. Now let's talk about the others, because there's so much going on. I'll leave the group bus to the end, because that was just stuff to make it mesh with the drums. So let's first talk about the bass, and again, one of my big secret weapons, because this thing sounds massive. And that's Mike playing the bass himself, and especially when we get the dirt channel, which is parallel. That's massive, and that's blended with the drums like this. So you can really pick out the anger on it, but it's not in your face. It's not like, oh, if I was mixing a gent track, I would have made sure it was much more rude and mid-focused, but it didn't warrant it. So let's see what I did. Firstly, so the amp and the dirt channel are folded so that they just go together into the same setup. That they both sounded great and didn't need any separate corrective EQ, which is always good. So I used an API EQ to boost 3K to really bring that growl out, but also on the clean sound bring the ting ting out. And so yeah, only use two things. Submissions, double tap. I love double tap. I used to do this with like 9 plugins in a row, multi-band compressor and all sorts of stuff, and now I don't have to. It's split into controlling the low end only with a compressor, then keeping everything together with like an optical style compressor. And so if I just turn off a couple of plugins, this is how the bass sounded, which was good, but very dynamic, doesn't sit. So suddenly with this, the low end is just one piece and then the whole thing stays together, and so when there are level jumps, it's not offensive. And then my trick that I use a lot for bass is micro shift from Soundtoys. A lot of people use the Yamaha SPX90, like I've now got the Rev 7 behind me, which is its big brother, and they'll use the symphonic preset to do this. It's something that Andy Wallace did on the Nevermind album by Nirvana, and it sounds huge. I use microshift to do the same thing. The wet-dry mix very much depends on the track, and the focus knob in the full microshift is the lifesaver because you can bring this up quite high, and the low end is then not touched by it. But what it does is it slightly pitches down one side and slightly pitches up the other side. So there's no chorusing, there's no actual chorusing because it doesn't move. Whereas the SPX90, it does actually kind of move a little bit. This doesn't, and it sounds chorusy, but because it's not going, it's not as obvious to the ear in a full mix. And because it's just a slight pitch effect, it's not messing with the phase, which means that it's mono compatible really, really well. And so that sits underneath. If I was to turn that off and play it with the drums, you would suddenly hear that grind in the middle. Turn it on and it's still there, but it's not right in the middle of your head like an itch you need to scratch. So that's why I do that. And then in a metal mix, then I've got more space for the snare, for the vocal, guitar solos, that kind of thing. I'm just getting a crucial element of the mix that I still want to not just be sat right in the middle of my brain. So, haha. And now we get on to the real, what makes it a mic track and not just a person's track, because we get on to things like the chunky organs. That is a ripping organ, and all that's on that is soothe. Oh, and a bit of that room reverb, which you can feel now it's in isolation. So I ended up focusing on the 2K area on this because the organ sounded great, but in the mids, that kind of scratchy scratch was, again, it was interfering with the focus, which was the drums. And you can see that that it's full of that because even higher up, it's allowed to do soothing, and it's not moving anything. And then there is a second organ later on, and that's only at the very end. So I just fader balanced that, and that was fine. The chunky piano. Let's have a look at you. So this was kind of an electric piano, Fender Rhodes Wurlitzer-y kind of sound, slightly distorted already, so I didn't need to saturate it. So what I did do was bring out more of that saturation-y thing at 3K by the look of it, and take some mud out around 700 Hz-ish. And made it a bit more lean and mean, and sent some of that to that room reverb. And then I used micro shift again on this, but much less than on the bass. This is just there to just add a certain something, and it's on style 3, which is the more obvious style. The first two are presets lifted from an Eventide H3000 Ultra Harmonizer, and number 3 is taken from an AMS unit, I believe. An AMS unit that could kind of bend space and time a little bit, but it was more obvious the way it did it. So it's not completely removed it from the center image, but it's just kind of softened off that center, and that just felt right to me. The synth. Yeah, so that one sat in the center image, where the organ was kind of full stereo. Yeah. That's why I did that, that's right. So the organ was all the way wide, so I made that piano kind of like half wide, and then the synth was right in the middle, and the three of them then sat in their own stereo spaces and just sounded like a big wall, but a wall that you could pick details out of. Right, yeah, so I added more saturation to this with the Hollywood preamp, and then took a little bit high end off the top because it was just a little bit toppy, a little bit scratchy. So from this... Oh, and I removed everything below, looks like 90-ish hertz as well, because it had a thing that was just adding to the bass guitar at times, but then not adding at other times, and it made it feel lumpy in the low end. So that was cleared out in the lows, not because it was bad, but because it just made things function better. The intro, what did I do with the intro? Very little. The intro, that's right. So the intro had these lo-fi drums, and it had this intro clav, and all I did was just take low end out of them both, but in different ways. I used a shelf on the clav, so it still had some low end, but not a lot. And yeah, just shelved out the lo-fi drums so that they sounded more lo-fi, because that's what they sounded like before. But because they had some wumpy wump low end in, when it hit with the drums, it didn't have as much impact. So by clearing out the low end here, it made it sound a little bit kind of like less strong. And by being less strong, the dynamic hit here, that's where it goes crazy. There you go. So there's also piano F, which is loud piano for anyone who doesn't speak piano. Looks like this one took a little work to fit it in. So I would have done this backwards. I would not have done this left to right. I would have done this right to left. Because I'm weird. But the reason for that is I would have started by using the EQ to carve out the low end, brighten the top, maybe brighten that kind of 3K area, and take out that 500 hertz thing. Again, I wouldn't have done a lot of this in solo. I would have done this with other instruments running, usually the non-drums running, because the way that I see it, the drums are transient instruments, so they overlay over non-transient instruments. That's the way that I visualize it most of the time. And so on that, I then needed the piano to be a little bit controlled, because it was a little bit bangy, which is part of the performance, but not part of the mix. So I used the VCA compressor, the 401, to just, you'll see it tickle. And yeah, so some of the bigger hits, the bam, 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 it was jumping above the other instruments and then going back down and then going bah, 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 gone. Bah, bah, bah. And so by getting a few dB of compression here, just enough, it sounded louder at the hits without actually being so much louder that it dominated the rest of this group. And then the saturation is kind of a magic thing that just makes things really sit in their place in a mix much better. In fact, I'll play the entire mix, turn the saturation off, and watch this piano disappear. So that saturation there suddenly brought it from the back of the mix to nearer the front of the mix, but without dominating and just stomping all over everything like a big clumsy Godzilla. Saturation in the right measures can really, really do magic. And then there is a second piano, which I grouped together 2 piano tracks and treated them like a single thing because they felt to me like a single thing. There was piano P, which is soft, and the verb. So I was given the piano and its reverb separately, and I just grouped them and said, this is one thing. And it looks like I grouped this and just copy-pasted the same from the same piano sound from the other virtual mix rack. It worked, and it looks like I didn't have to change much, if anything. Looks like I might have taken the... Yeah, 1.8, not point. Yeah, so I took a little bit of the high frequency boost back, and and I changed the threshold on the compressor by the look of it because I didn't want as much. Yeah, so I wanted more compression on the soft piano. The soft piano also is automated to be quite loud there and a little bit less loud later. And then there's also a track called Nay, which is these flutes. And that one got the maximum micro shift treatment. That got death by doubling. It was mostly because the higher notes were really kind of jamming in the center of my brain and really becoming quite obnoxious. So the heavy microshift really moved it out of the way. And the big low cut to 300 Hz and 600 Hz dip just stopped it from being raw all over the rest of the mix. I think the question for me was, can the essence of this instrument be retained? Can the feel be retained without losing the hearing of the instrument? So I took out the bits we don't need to hear and moved it to the sides. And then, yeah, it worked. And then last thing, apart from volume automations, which were just, I need more of this, I need less of that at certain points. So things like the ride cymbals. Oh, I didn't even mention the toms. I'll go back to them because they were a bit of a pain. But the main thing that I did here, apart from, like I say, bringing volumes up and down as needed as parts of the song, you'll see my automations don't look like something that Spike Stent would do. They don't look like down. They look very much like up a bit, later, down a bit, I try and be a bit more Andy Wallace-ish, that he will go, right, for this section I want more of this, push, hands off. For this I want more of that or less of that, push, hands off. And if I've got my compression right and I've got every element right, I shouldn't need to do crazy amounts of automation because the mix should be taking care of itself. And if it isn't, then maybe there's one rogue element and that may need kind of a bit of that. But generally speaking, I try and avoid heavy automation where possible because things shouldn't need it. They should either be dynamic or they should be controlled. And if I've not made a dynamic track dynamic, then I need to change the settings. If I've made a control track not controlled enough, clamp it down more. So that's the way I work. But yes, once I had the drums together and I had the others together, I then used this on the others bus, which is the gold EQ, which is an EVQ. And that was just me then tinkering to find the balance, because I'd balanced everything together apart from the drums, and it was then a back and forth between the drums and the everything else. And so I decided then the sound of the drums was kind of sacrosanct and to move everything else around them. And so you'll see little things here like another 360 hertz kind of dip here, tiny little bit of 100 hertz push. The 1K was the 1.6K here on this EQ was the big thing. One of the mixes, I really pushed that, and Mike's reaction was, I can hear too much of this, too much of that, too much of this. So if I just undo that tiny change that I just made, let's see how far back I need to go. That's it, so hardly any change. So yeah, not even from this notch to that notch, and suddenly the whole of everything was just like whoosh, right forwards. You can do so much with one EQ. It's crazy. And so, but I was trying to balance that with Track Spacer. Track Spacer is an amazing plugin as long as you use it very, very gently. I use it on a lot of mixes, but not until all my elements kind of sit right with each other and I'm looking for that final percentage. What this does, I have a chain going from the drum group to a side chain of Track Spacer. And so when I hit play now, you'll see it do big dips. And so every time a drum hits in a certain frequency, the rest of these tracks get dipped down in only that frequency by an amount that I set with this knob, and I've got 11%. If I went crazy with it, you would hear it really. I also have kind of a stop here so that below 100 and something hertz, it doesn't get affected. So the low end of the bass is then solid and doesn't pump because of Track Spacer. But this, that's basically gone now. So I just find the percentage where I can still hear everything. And if I click sidechain, no, that's I was sure there was a button here to hear the inverse, but I guess not. And I usually use Waves Factory, Track Spacer in a mix when I've got something like kind of a background keyboard or something that the band likes, but they don't want it to be at the front of the mix. I'll get an EQ on it where I can feel it and I've not just lost it. Then I'll use Track Spacer so that any other instruments like guitar or vocals or anything that have to take precedence will automatically duck that other element away, so that I don't have to then make the key element louder and make it feel like my mix is being overbearing with, I don't know, vocals or guitar or whatever. And then I'm not fighting in the age-old kind of push the faders war. Makes life so much easier. That's almost it. but then I will look at the toms because, oh boy, at the time we tracked the toms through DBX 160 compressors, all of them. And it sounded awesome, but what I don't think we realised was just how much that brought the bleed up, because we were tracking with AKG 414s on the toms, which they're not the most kind of directional microphone. So with... let's take all the plugins off these and you'll hear just how much... you can hear that just for a second. Let's unmute these and you'll hear just how much bleed is on the 4 mics. I'm sure you'll agree that's a lot of bleed, and it was so much bleed that it made gating very difficult. Originally I used Gatey Weighty by Boz Labs on a few of the toms, which is one of my favourite gates. You can use it in a kind of frequency dependent way, so that, especially, yeah, I've kept that on the floor tom actually, so that it lets the gate open all the time, but only on either the low frequencies or the high frequencies, so you can let some bleed through, but not the annoying frequencies like this. Which I could have been more aggressive with that gate, but then you end up fighting with gates, especially on sections later on like this. Mike saying you should have used Oxford drum gate. Well, I didn't have it at the time. That's the thing. I now have Oxford drum gate and it's great. But I've used Gatey Weighty for so long, it kind of did a job, but I also then just went in and manually did this and just stripped the toms myself to exactly what I needed and nothing else, and then used the gates to soften the tails. So hopefully, I mean, that should be doing something now. But yeah, yes, Mike's giving everyone in the chat kind of a rundown on Oxford Drumgate. It's amazing. I got it recently and I'm not going back. But this worked well enough for this track. And what did I do? I think I was pretty aggressive with the EQ on these. So you can see, like, on the high toms, I absolutely did a Chris Lord algae and just cranked that low mid. So I found the frequency on each one of these. Undo, and absolutely just went to town on it. So, like, here's the top two toms without that EQ. And they sound nice, but they sound anemic. And suddenly I turn that on. And ba-dum-ba-dumph. Yeah, don't be afraid of using EQ. If it's got something you want in it, crank it. It's just a knob. It's not going to hurt you. And also, I used a distressor with a 4-to-1 here and quite a slow attack to get more click. But you can see in the end that it only shaves a couple of dB off because the DBX 160s that we used already did a lot of the heavy lifting. So I didn't really need to double up on that. And those are then panned. I had them harder panned, but I don't think Mike was keen on the hard pan thing, which is fine. A lot of what I do with this kind of thing is get it to where I like it, and then when we get to the artist intent, they go, I'd like more of this, I'd like less of that, not too keen on that. You just go, okay, how's this? And that's absolutely fine with me. So yeah, I did exactly the same with Rack 3, and the floor tom I used a bell because the green EQ didn't go that low. Looks like I really scooped out some 300 hertz on that one. Because especially near the end, with the big. Yeah, that was a big game changer there. And so then all the toms that did have a bit of high end bleed, I used Soothe to get rid of the remaining k. And they all went to the room, and the snare verb, which then blends them in with the actual snare. And they sound like they're in so much reverb, but once I put in all the tops, and because that's the other thing, that I kind of had to mix this backwards, because if I don't put in the close mics, this is what I get. There's so much going on in this track before I even put the close mics in that I really have to do the mix backwards thing, which I do so much, which is get all of my cymbal mics, room mics, and everything sounding great and sounding where I want them, and then blend in what I've got left. So yeah, and I only put in that much reverb on the toms after playing, I think, this section and finding that they sounded super dry. But yeah, because of the combination of the compressed overheads and everything, doing all this stuff, all the transient hits on the toms jumped out a mile, which meant that what I was trying to do with the tom microphones, the close mics, was bring in that low end, that goomph, and not more cymbals. I didn't need to bring out the top end with the close mics. Because it was already there. Because I wasn't looking for metal toms with the click, click, click. I was just looking for that weight, which was in there. I just had to kind of bring it out. But when the pianos go in, especially, the pianos got so much transient as well that psychoacoustically, it feels like there's enough already. Turn the toms off. Weirdly, it feels like the toms are kind of hard panned and we're only missing them a little bit. I've muted the close mics on the toms there. Muted them. Okay, so I'm not hearing it super wide on the tops. How about the slammed stuff? Yeah. It's not them either. It's either the LOP or the DBXs. Yeah, so the LOP and the DBXs must have had the toms hard panned going into them, or at least much harder panned than we ended up in the finals, which is why they feel super wide, and probably why Mike wanted me to bring the pan of the close mics in, because the rooms with the compression on already had them out there, so mathematically I could have monoed probably all the close mics, and it still would have felt quite wide. Weird. Shush. So there you go. 26 plus tracks of drums that turned into 31 if you include the folders. And another 12, 14 tracks of audio, all come together to make one of Mike Malyan's solo releases that hurt my brain and very much enjoyed. So there you go. Thank you everybody for sticking around for a while. And I'll be back to regular programming very shortly. There's a major release coming up in a couple of days. And I need to finish filming that tomorrow and finish the editing. But I did a piece with Mike for that. So you'll see more of Mike on my channel very shortly. And you'll see more of me very shortly also. Thanks everybody for watching. And I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.